Welcome to my Sirocco presentation 2021. The title of my talk is Synchronous Concurrent Broadcasts for Intermittent Channels with Bounded Capacity. Let's begin with an introduction. This talk is about information dissemination, and we consider three different tasks: the single source broadcast, the multi-source broadcast, and the multi-message broadcast. The single source broadcast is the standard broadcast given a graph and a node V0 that holds a message M, and the task is to disseminate M across all nodes of the graph. Multi-source broadcast, we have a set of nodes which hold the same message M, and again the task is to disseminate M to all nodes. And finally, the multi-message broadcast, messages M0 to MS are located at different nodes, and the message may be different, and the task is to disseminate all messages to all nodes of the graph. I will present algorithms for all three types of broadcasts. So let's begin with the single source broadcast, and the standard way to perform a single source broadcast is flooding. There are various forms of flooding. The first one is deterministic flooding, where the originator sends a message with the information to all neighbors, and nodes receiving a message for the first time send it to all their neighbors. So this type of flooding is a stateful algorithm because each node keeps a record of which messages have already been arrived in order to avoid the cycling of messages forever. The second variant is probabilistic flooding, which is now a stateless algorithm. Messages are forwarded to neighbors based on a fixed probability. There are various forms of probabilistic flooding. And the number of messages is reduced, but only it delivers the message only with high probability to all nodes. 2 years ago at POTSI, another variant of deterministic flooding was introduced that was called Amnesiac flooding. In contrast to deterministic flooding, it's a stateless algorithm, albeit it works only in synchronous systems. And the simple mechanism is every time a node receives a message, it forwards it to those neighbors from which it did not receive a message in the current round. So here is a more formal presentation of amnesiac flooding. In round one, the node sends message to each neighbor. Then in the following rounds, each node V executes the following code. M, at the beginning of a round, M is initialized by the neighbors of V. And then whenever a neighbor sends this message M, it is deleted from M. If after receiving all messages in this round, M is not equal to the set of neighbors, meaning there was a message received, message sending is started, and all nodes which are in M will receive the message M. So if M is empty, no message is sent at all. This is the straightforward algorithm, and let me show you two examples. Here we have a simple graph with 4 nodes, and the black one is the originator of the message. In round one, it sends the message to its neighbors. And both neighbors forward the message to all neighbors from which they didn't receive a message. So this node just forwards it to here, while this node sends it to here and here, as shown here. In the next round, this node does nothing because it received the message from all neighbors. So the previously mentioned set M is empty. While this node sends a message again to here and to this node, and this one only sends to this one. So you see here the messages, and the algorithm stops because this node in this round receives a message from all neighbors, and the same holds for this one. So after 3 rounds, this has terminated. Here is the same graph for another originator, this node, and as you see, it takes 5 rounds to complete. And as we already see here, this edge plays a particular role because the message, as seen here, travels in both directions. This also holds for this edge, and this will be a crucial observation later in this talk. Now, the question was, does this algorithm terminate for all graphs? And to me, a little bit surprising, this is true, and this was shown in the Pozzi paper. And the algorithm, which I called AF, terminates, and each message is sent at most twice per edge. Now, crucial for the termination of AF is that forwarding of messages always performed in the round immediately following the reception. It no longer terminates when message forwarding is suspended. And this is the case we consider intermittent channels. So when a channel is not available, the message must be backed up and sent in the next round. So if you do a trivial extension to AF, this will not work as shown in this example. So these are the rounds 1, 2, 3, and node 2 is not available in round 1 and round 2 and round 3. This is indicated by this square, and node 3 is only unavailable in node 3. So in the first round, this is the initiator, sends the message to 1, 2, and 3. But 2 and 3 cannot forward it because the channel is not available. But 1 can forward it. Yeah? So these messages are then received in the next round, round 2. Node 2 receives again a message, but it cannot forward it. So by now it has received a message from 0 and from 2, and so on. Yeah? And if you continue this, what you will see that after 9 rounds, we have this constellation, this configuration, and this was already present here in round 5. Yeah? So this means that the algorithm does not terminate, and it toggles between, it repeats this 5 cycle. Okay, so the task we set for ourselves is, can we extend the algorithm to work even when message forwarding is suspended? So what are the contributions of this paper? We extend amnesiac flooding to the case of channel suspensions, limited number of channel suspensions, and the new algorithm is called AFI, I for intermittent. We use this algorithm, interesting enough, to prove that the original algorithm is also correct for multi-source broadcasting. This was our original intention, and when we tried to prove this, we came up with this idea. And so once we have this algorithm and its correctness, multi-source broadcasting for the original one is not difficult to prove. Furthermore, we present algorithms for multi-message broadcast as defined earlier on. Okay, so let's begin with a single source and intermittent channels. So why intermittent channels? What are reasons for channel unavailabilities? External interferences, for example. Traffic with higher priority than the broadcast. Or the capacity of the communication channel is exhausted due to several ongoing concurrent broadcasts. So it's not an artificial assumption, it's quite realistic. Of course, if you have intermittent channels, the algorithms can no longer be completely stateless because the message has to be stored. Okay, so what's the basic idea of this new algorithm? The idea is rather simple. If a message cannot be forwarded in the current round, it's postponed until the next available round with the same parity. So we assign parities to rounds 0, 1, 0, 1. This has not to be synchronized between nodes, so each node can start with any parity it likes. Now down here is the same example now, which did not terminate for the trivial extension, and then now it terminates after 5 rounds. Let's see what happens. So in round 1, node 0 sends a message to node 2, which it cannot forward. So this is an odd round. In round 2, the message comes from node 1, and node 2 is still, the channel is still not available. So this is stored under even parity. In round 3, the node 2 receives a message from 5. The channel is still not available. Yeah, so in odd rounds, this node receives a message from 5 and from 0. So it remains it remains to send it to node 1. Yeah. Okay. This is the principle of this algorithm, and I show you the formal code here. So we have a variable parity that indicates the parity of a round, and then we have a set M as before, but now we have 2 sets for even parity and for odd parity, which we initialize with this bottom symbol, the purpose you see in a minute. Now, in each node executes in every round the following. Upon receiving message M from neighbor W, W is added to M with the according parity. Yeah? And then when all messages are received, if the channel is available again, and there are nodes in this set corresponding M parity, then to all nodes, to all neighbors which are not in parity, the message is sent. At the end, the set parity is cleared, and we have the volume bottom here, and finally the parity changes for the next round. Now, what does a node do if it wants to broadcast a message M? It just assigns M the empty set. So we have to distinguish these 2 cases, because if it's the empty set, then in the first round, M is sent to all neighbors. Yeah, whereas this bottom indicates that all neighbors send the message, and therefore nothing is to do. So this is the algorithm, AFI, intermittent amnesiac flooding. So let's see about the proof that it's correct and about the time complexity. We define the notion of an availability scheme to express intermittent channels. So A is a mapping from V cross N to the Boolean values, such that when a node V can send a message in round CV, this value is true, otherwise it's false. This is called an availability scheme for G and V0 if the number of pairs where the channel is not available is bounded. If it's unbounded, then of course it may happen that a message cannot be delivered to all nodes. Okay, here's the first result. Let G be a graph, A an availability scheme, and F the number of unavailabilities at different nodes and rounds. Now, algorithm AFI delivers a message, respectively terminates after at most IM of G plus 2F rounds. It terminates at most 1 round later. And the message is forwarded 2E times, so at most twice over each edge, unless G is bipartite when the message goes once over each edge. Okay, so what's the idea of the proof? The idea of the proof is the following. We will reduce AFI to the standard amnesic flooding, but on a different graph. So for a given availability scheme A and a given graph, we construct a new graph, which is a directed bipartite graph, which I denote by BA of V0, such that, and that's the point, the execution of the intermediate version on G with respect to A is equivalent to executing the normal algorithm, amnesiac flooding, on this substitute graph with no intermittent channels. So when we prove this, we can take over results that we have for amnesiac flooding for this extended graph and transfer them back to results on the original graph. Okay, so I want to briefly give you an idea of how this substitute graph BA looks like. The starting point for the construction is the double cover G of V0. So what is a double cover? Here's an example. You see a graph here on the left, and which we are used before. These two edges are special. They are cross edges. That means that the distance of the end nodes is the same to the originating node. So in this case, it's both 2. So in this graph, we have 2 of those cross edges. Yeah? You can also determine them with a breadth first search. Now, what you do is you take you remove the cross edges, then you take 2 copies, this one and the other one, I added a prime to each node. And for each cross edge, you introduce 2 edges here, which are twisted. So this one goes from 1 to 2. So this one goes from 1 to 2 prime and 2 to 1 prime. Okay, now, if you execute the amnesic flooding on this algorithm, the message, this is a bipartite graph, by the way, the messages flow top down and left to right. And no message goes twice via an edge. So this is, we have amnesiac flooding on these 2 graphs is equivalent. Now, but this is only the first step. The second step, when we introduce now the intermittent channel, so the idea is the following. We stretch this graph over time, yeah, because at some points the channel is not available. And we define this new graph layer by layer, starting from V0. And the nodes of these new graphs are of 2 types, either copies of the original nodes or what we call dummy nodes. They correspond to times when a channel is unavailable. Yeah, let's see an example, which is shown here for the graph we had earlier. So in the first round, the originator sends a message to 3, 2, and 1, its neighbors. But node 2 is unavailable in this round. Yeah. So therefore, we have here a dummy node, and the successor of the dummy node is a copy of the original node. Okay, the same here for node 3, which is also not available in the first round. Node 2 is not available in the second round, but it receives a message here. In this case, it's 2 prime. So again, this is followed by a dummy node, followed by the node itself. So, so the idea is that we consider the unavailable times by adding 2 edges and a dummy node for each unavailable slot. Now, when we execute AF, the original algorithm on this graph, then the dummy nodes behave as normal nodes. They forward the message. And so this is the basic idea. And then we show in the paper that the execution of the two algorithm, AF, the original one on this one, and AFI, the intermittent one on G, they are equivalent. And the proof is too long to present here in this short presentation. But a crucial insight is that there is a one-to-one mapping between the edges of G and those of BA that are not incident to dummy edge. So that means that in amnesiac flooding, because this is a bipartite graph, the message goes once over each edge. Since it's equivalent for AF for intermittent amnesiac flooding, and the number of edges without dummy nodes is the same as in G, we immediately get the result that AF, the intermittent amnesiac flooding, also requires only 2E messages. Okay, in the remaining minutes, I want to go briefly over the other cases, multi-source broadcasting. And so the motivation for this is disaster monitoring, where you have, for example, fire detection in the forest and several nodes detect the fire at the same time, and they've broadcast an alarm message. So this is a typical scenario for multi-source broadcasting. And the idea is we reduce it to the case of a single node by introducing a virtual source. This is shown on the next slide. We have 3 originators. We introduce this virtual source connected to the originators, and then we have to extend the definition of the double cover. This virtual node is not repeated here, so this is just a technical issue. And then we can define we can present our theorem under the conditions I stated earlier. We have these nodes V1 to Vk that broadcast the same message, and they do this before they receive M from another node. We can show that this AFI delivers M in at most the same number of rounds and terminates in the same number of rounds and uses the same number of messages. So our result clearly takes over to multi-source broadcasts. Finally, multi-message broadcasts. This is the most interesting case. Multi-message, multiple nodes initiate broadcasts, each with its own message, even when broadcasts from previous initiations have not completed. And if you have unlimited channel capacities, then this is no problem. You can use the original algorithm. But we assume here that we have limited capacities. So the number of messages you send per round is bounded. And therefore you cannot use the original algorithm and repeat it. Our theorem in this case is the following. We provide an extension of the algorithm that eventually terminates and delivers its message of any sequence of broadcasts of messages with different identifiers. And the number of messages it requires is the same. More details can be found in the paper. Conclusion. In this paper, we presented a broadcast algorithm for intermediate channels. It's an extension of amnesiac floodings. And we use this algorithm to prove that broadcast versions for other problems, the multi-source broadcast and the multi-message broadcast, are also correct with the same time complexities under the assumption of bounded channel capacities. The full paper is available on the archive and contains more details and all the proofs which I could not present here. Okay, this is the end. So I thank you for listening, and thank you and goodbye.